the world has welcomed in a lineup of new leaders in recent months. On today's After 10, we take a look at the tip and balance of diplomatic relations throughout the world. To help us do that, we are honored to be joined by the former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd.
Former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd. With his distinct style in the diplomatic field, he has earned the respect of both the U.S. and China. On today's After 10, we speak to Kevin Rudd about Asia's growth and the role that Asian leaders will play in it.
Mr. Rudd, thank you very much for taking time to speak with us today. We appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
Let's talk a little bit about the challenges that do exist in the region, beginning with a piece that you penned recently for Foreign Policy magazine. You called the territorial conflicts in the region, likening them to a 21st century redux of the Balkans a century ago. You used the phrase a tinderbox on water. Here I had you pegged as an optimist. This is a bit of a pragmatic approach, but also a bleak outlook on the current situation here. Is there any room for optimism as you see the things playing out here?
The best optimists I've ever met in the world are also pragmatists. In other words, there's a pragmatic foundation for their optimism. What's the pragmatic foundation for my optimism? It's that the economies of this region are becoming closer and closer and more deeply integrated with each other. And that's a product of the forces of economic globalization over a long period of time. However, at the same time, let's be pragmatically realistic in acknowledging that unresolved territorial disputes are littered literally right across the East Asian hemisphere. The Korean Peninsula, of course, stands out. Also territorial disputes between Korea and Japan, between China and Japan, cross straits tensions still with Taiwan, although now in a good condition, the South China Sea, and of course elsewhere in Asia as well. So what I'm saying is that these unresolved territorial disputes exist. We can't wish them away. They've been the subject of recent high-level political and security tensions, in particular the continuing standoff on the Korean Peninsula. And so therefore what we need to do in order to prevent future conflict from arising is to build strategic trust in this region, step by step, institutionally, diplomatically, along the lines of various of the proposals that I've put out, both in Foreign Policy magazine, but also Foreign Affairs magazine, most recently too.
China, of course, a central player in all of this. The U.S. trying to become more of a central player in its pivot to Asia, announced about a year or so ago in your home country. When you look at the current bilateral relationship between China and the U.S., and when you look at the potential for what it could be, what do you see? I know you have a lot of thoughts on this matter.
Well, my own judgment is that we need a new strategic roadmap for US-China relations for the period ahead. In many respects, we have a remarkable historical opportunity. President Obama has just achieved his re-election. Xi Jinping has just been appointed for his first 5-year term. And we have a coincidence of the political terms of these two significant leaders for our region's future. Secondly, there's been much controversy over the US rebalance to Asia. The truth is, the strategic fundamentals of the United States' continuing presence in wider East Asia has been underpinned by the rebalance. Therefore, it's time now to go beyond the rebalance onto the next step, which is beginning to build strategic trust. There is an enormous trust deficit in the China-US relationship. And so what I've recommended in the article I've written for Foreign Affairs magazine is the following. Number one, both sides should commit to regular summitry, not just every now and then, but on a regular basis, several times a year, in each other's capitals or using international conferences where both leaders are present. Two, both sides now need a new point man on the China-US relationship. China needs its own Henry Kissinger. The United States needs the new Henry Kissinger. I know Henry very well. I love him dearly, but he's 90 years old. And even Henry would admit that others should be taking up the challenge. Thirdly, on the content of the agenda, What is needed is a program of work. On the global order questions, global rules-based order, how do China and the United States make the order work? Is it concluding the trade round over Doha? Is it taking new steps forward in nuclear non-proliferation so that we deal with the problem on the Korean Peninsula or the emerging problems with Iran or elsewhere? At the regional level, using the East Asian Summit, where the United States is now a member, to begin to fashion step-by-step confidence and security building measures in East Asia, where presently we have no such arrangements, so that a conflict at sea by accident can automatically, it seems, run the risk of turning into a much larger conflict. And finally, at a bilateral level, between China and the United States, having the militaries have a regular dialogue with each other at Chairman of the Joint Chiefs level, so that the vexed question of cybersecurity can also be dealt with.
How confident are you that the right steps are going to be taken, and what is the sort of the room for error as we move forward as well?
Well, I have a view that the worst form of foreign policy is one which sort of sits around and waits for something to happen and says, isn't that a terrible thing? How are we going to react to it? The best form of foreign policy is one which seeks to anticipate what lies around the corner or over the horizon and work out a concrete strategy to avoid that and to create a different future. So, in the absence of a proactive policy, what I call a new roadmap for US-China relations, what I'm deeply concerned about is the state of strategic drift in the US-China relationship. And when you have strategic drift, there's a danger that non-cooperation becomes not just competition, but ultimately translates into conflict, and ultimately in a worst case scenario translates into war. There is a reversed mindset, which is how do we actually avoid that long-term destination by building or rebuilding strategic trust step by step, not in some wild, idealistic, optimistic frame of mind, which is we all believe in peace and brotherhood of humankind starting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. That's a nonsense. But what you can do step by step is say, why don't we cooperate on that and make that work? Maybe that's the current global trade order. Maybe we should cooperate on this, which is how do we avoid incidents at sea by having elaborate protocols between our navies and our coast guards. And once you've done both of those things, you say, you know, we can cooperate. We've done that, what next can we do? That's what I argue as being the only viable strategy for the future. And the US needs to take a lead.
When you take a look at Korea, they are geographically, strategically in the center of this relationship when we're talking about China and the US. What role do you see Korea playing in the future, and what advice might you give to the Korean government as to the role that they should be playing as we move forward?
Well, far be it from me as a visitor to the Republic of Korea to provide public advice to President Park. I've been a good friend over the last 5 years with President Lee. We have worked very closely together on a whole range of G20 questions, and from Australia's perspective, security questions. We now have agreement for regular 2+2 dialogue of foreign ministers and defence ministers, and I believe we'll soon conclude a free trade agreement. I was pleased to be able to meet with President Park when I was in Seoul, together with other leaders and former leaders from around the region. And I certainly wish her well in what is a daunting challenge. I believe the settings that she's outlined are strong and good settings. And she also wishes to build trust. But trust with North Korea can only be built step by step and based on the verification of North Korean actions. And if you look at past North Korean actions, whether it is the murder of South Korean sailors through the sinking of the Chonan, the bombardment of South Korean territory, together with nuclear tests and ballistic missile tests, there's not a big basis for trust. However, I would say this. I believe that the Korean government's interest in pursuing a close relationship with China and an intimate dialogue with China on China's own relationship and ability to influence North Korea is now critical. In China itself, there is now something of a public reappraisal of China's overall strategic interests in North Korea long term. The Chinese are frustrated with the North Koreans. I believe there's therefore a basis for a very productive discussion between the ROK and the PRC on how to deal with the North Korean regime in the future. And that is a live opportunity for President Park so early in her administration.
Do you see China taking those right steps right now? Do you think they're moving in the right direction as it pertains to North Korea?
Well, a year ago, I began saying to friends and colleagues and writing here and there that our friends in China were beginning internally to reappraise how their close relationship with North Korea was affecting China's own interests negatively. What is interesting 12 months later, particularly following the third underground nuclear test by North Korea and the most recent ballistic missile test into the Central Pacific, that the discussion of Chinese policy towards North Korea is now being held in public. We've now seen in the last month or so 4 or 5 significant statements from Chinese foreign policy intellectuals, think tanks, as well as government officials questioning the future direction of China's North Korea policy, asking this fundamental question: is it in China's long-term national interests to continue to offer a blank check to the North Koreans? Or is China going to suffer as a consequence? And when you think that through, by continuing to back North Korea, there is a real danger that China's national aspiration to be a respected great power around the world begins to be negatively affected. Secondly, by virtue of North Korea's actions in its nuclear policy, incrementally what you are going to see is other US allies in Asia working much more closely together on ballistic missile defense cooperation against the North Koreans. From China's perspective beyond the Korean Peninsula, that represents a new set of challenges, which from a Chinese national security perspective may not be entirely welcome. And then finally, there's purely the economic cost, frankly, of continuing to support the North Korean economy, one which fails to feed its own people.
I know you have close ties to China. You spend a lot of time there and have spent a lot of time there. You've also said in the past that China's strengthened position in the international community should be looked at as being a positive rather than a negative. There are some that clearly view it as being a negative. Why such a positive view of China's increasing role in the world from your perspective?
I think one of the problems in Western and international analysis of China today is that we get locked into black or white. We seem to have a binary analysis of China. China good, China bad, China black, China white. Last time I looked at most nation states around the world, there are often great shades of grey. So therefore, from China's perspective also, there has been an historical tendency to group various nation states around the world as fanzhong or qinzhong, the Chinese words for anti-Chinese or pro-Chinese. These are Cold War concepts. They actually don't lend themselves to the current international political reality. So if we look at the current pragmatic reality that confronts us with China's behaviour in the world, if it was not for China and the strength of its economy, the world would have plunged into a very long-term recession or worse. Most of the growth in the global economy over the last 5 years has come out of East Asia and on the back of China's own continued growth at 7 to 8%. So we need to bear that in mind in terms of if you've got a job in Korea today, it may be because the Chinese economy is growing, similarly to my friends in Australia. Now, at the same time, as China seeks to expand its foreign policy and security policy influence across East Asia, certainly that creates concerns on the part of many countries. That's a pragmatic reality as well. Why I have outlined what I believe is practical step-by-step trust-building exercises across East Asia to avoid competition, conflict, or even war, is to deal with that reality, rather than just say that somehow conflict is inevitable. That's not, I believe, a productive approach to foreign policy.
Let's shift gears a little bit to the Korea-Australia Free Trade Agreement. You kickstarted negotiations 4 years ago, this month actually, on that FTA. Less than 2 years ago, you proudly announced that the deal was near conclusion. Here we stand today. The pact is not in place, of course. From your viewpoint, obviously you're not involved as much as you were before, of course, but from your viewpoint now, where do things stand now and how much progress needs to be made before a deal is actually put into place?
Well, the Australia-Korea relationship, I think, is in excellent shape, and that's borne out by where we were 5 years ago and where we are today, across most measures. The security relationship I've already spoken about, and let's never forget that tens of thousands of Australian troops came here and fought for the defence of South Korea at a time when there may not have any longer been a Republic of Korea. And many of those Australian troops remain buried here on Korean soil. So we're very conscious of the importance of this country. Secondly, as I said, we've made advances in the security and foreign policy relationship. It's now very close. The economic side, we now loom as somewhere between the top 7 trading partners with each other around the world. We are economies of approximately the same size. Australia is a little larger. And we are both members of the G20, we're both members of the UN Security Council. I do think, however, that given where we are with the economic relationship, it could grow from this to this. Now, obviously, there are outstanding concerns on the Korean side concerning the investment regime and dispute resolution, and on the Australian side with access to Korean agricultural markets. Can I say, I think the recent Korean management of its own domestic politics concerning the FTA with the United States has been a complex exercise in South Korean politics. Recent South Korean elections, both for the National Assembly and for the presidency, have all occurred within the last year or so. So I think we're now entering into a more normal political season in terms of being able to bring these outstanding issues to conclusion. But I'm confident, given that these are, between ourselves, we have $3 trillion worth of economic activity. We're about a $1.4 trillion economy, Korea is about 1.3. These are big economies. There's a lot of business to be done. And so let's understand that by opening these doors, we can actually transform each other's economies, quite apart from our integration with the economic growth of wider East Asia.
You sound rather confident that a deal will be met in the near future?
Well, as you said before, I'm not actively involved in the negotiations, but I believe there is a way forward, and it will require all of us, Australia and Korea, to find an accommodation point. And I think our diplomats and our ministers are capable and equipped to do that. When I was Prime Minister of Australia, we invited now President Park to Australia as a guest of government way back in 2008. I spent a lot of time with her then discussing her country's future and our bilateral relationship. And we warmly reflected upon those earlier meetings. And I'm confident that she will be a good president for this country. The challenges for Korea are large. Geography has not been kind to you in terms of where you have landed. But the Korean people are remarkably robust, remarkably creative, and to have founded a country over 60 years when there was not much other than rubble 60 years ago is a tribute to the Korean people.
As we look ahead to the next 5 years under President Park Geun-hye, what expectations do you have for her and South Korea as it pertains to this role in the international community?
Well, in the next couple of years, we both have 2 sets of very large global challenges on our hands. One is global peace and security. We are both non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. We are on there together. Australia is currently chairman of the Sanctions Committee of the United Nations Security Council. We have both been active members of the UN from the beginning. So on the complex global questions of Syria, on the complex global questions of Iran, on the complex global questions and regional questions of the DPRK, frankly, as middle powers, our creative approach to foreign policy is relevant to how we deal with problems across the global stage as well. And that is where being a good international citizen is important both for Australia and Korea. Our second set of opportunities and responsibilities together, of course, lie with the G20. After the G20 this year in Russia, it will be hosted in Australia next year. And we clearly see that the global economy has a long way yet to recover. Therefore, Korea and Australia working collaboratively on a roadmap for global economic recovery is, I believe, pivotal. looking at the new drivers of economic growth, trade liberalisation, the empowerment of women so that they actually have a greater participation in the workforces of the world to provide a new increment of growth. Dealing with the 1.4 billion people who live in poverty, because if they begin to be liberated from poverty, they generate economic activity themselves. The new drivers of sustainable green growth in the world. These are massive investment opportunities, not just costs. Put those things together, the frame we need to apply is how do we generate the next increment of global economic growth and do so equitably with those parts of the world who are currently not enjoying these opportunities, and sustainably so there's a planet for our children to inherit.
Mr. Kevin Rudd, we thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for being here.
Good to be in Korea.